It's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Alison Brysk. She is the Duncan and Suzanne Mellencamp Professor of Global Governance at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she is the author or editor of 14 books on human rights, including Speaking Rights to Power, From Tribal Village to Global Village, Human Rights and Private Wrongs, and most recently, The Struggle. The Struggle to End Violence Against Women. If you look at the back table, the table in the back of the room, she features two of her books there. She has done Fulbrights, many, many other things that I don't want to go into because I don't want to take away from her lecture time, but it's a pleasure to have her here. And her topic is Why Rights Are Right, the Politics of Persuasion. Please welcome Professor Brysk.
So thank you very, very much for this opportunity and the invitation. I'm just delighted to learn more about the Baha'i Chair and the World Peace Program. And I think we need this kind of dialogue more than ever in the difficult times in which we live. One of the things that's very interesting for me is that I have done a lot of books. The list includes edited volumes as well as my own or about half a dozen personal projects, and over 25 years. My work is mostly empirical rather than philosophical. I try to think analytically. I try to think a little bit about the theoretical basis on which we're making human rights appeals, but it's a great opportunity for me to think about the nature of the kinds of appeals that we're making and how that plays into the success of human rights campaigns and whether the kinds of institutional measures and treaties and principles that are being enacted globally are going to be effective. So I am mostly interested in the effectiveness of concrete campaigns and policies for human rights, but I am reminded as I listen to these presentations of how important it is to periodically revisit the basis of which principles we're arguing for and how we're arguing for them. So my title has changed a little bit as well. I think that's actually a good sign and a healthy thing when we are asked to speak on something and it stimulates us to think about a slightly related topic. And part of that is because the title of my last full single-authored book is Speaking Rights to Power. And so that, of course, plays on speaking truth to power, speaking rights to power. And so the photo on the first slide here is from the cover of that book. And this is from a demonstration that I attended in India. I thought that this really helped to symbolize the claim, the fundamental ethos that is claimed of a man wearing a t-shirt that says simply human being. And it reminded me of the US civil rights movement, seeing people with sign, I am a man, the anti-apartheid movement, seeing the same kind of basic fundamental claim for recognition of common humanity, inclusion in the human community. And so I thought that was a good place to start. It starts my book that then considers the communication politics of 26 different human rights campaigns. But today, what I want to do is go back to those first principles that I simply read as the fundamental claim and think more about how they work, which I have been thinking about, but also, along with my fellow panelists, why they work. And so kind of bridging between the sociological, political, and legal dimensions to the ethical dimensions. Not sure if I can get to the moral dimensions, making that distinction. One of the reasons that I'm also have changed my title is that I want to reflect on the ethos of human rights, but in the edited volumes and the conferences and just the life of the past, certainly year in the US, and as I'm traveling in other parts of the world where human rights are increasingly beleaguered, I wanted to talk about the crisis of cosmopolitanism, because I think this is more than a challenge to human rights. There is a challenge to globalism, globalization, and the cosmopolitan ethos that goes along with that, and that is part of the foundation of human rights. So really need to think more about what that means. So the first thing is that, to try and begin to define what is the claim, what is human rights? And I was just interviewed and they said, so what is human rights? And I said, it is a set of evolving claims and principles that is then enacted in sometimes law, sometimes treaties, sometimes campaigns, and sometimes policies, that is sort of summarized on the principled basis, the ethos in Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says we are, in its preamble, free and equal in rights and dignity. So before you generate any lists, you have a right to this or that, or this person has a right, that group has a right, what is the ethos goal? And what's interesting to me, and the bit of theory that I have done, or the bit of analysis, is that if you take both sides of both of those pairs seriously, it can get you a little further than simply citing documents or deriving sort of fixed philosophical positions. So freedom and equality are related but distinct principles, and carry you in slightly different directions. Rights and dignity. So dignity language is already present in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that's an interesting thing to note in terms of the philosophical foundation and the kind of construction of a global understanding. Overall, this is going to circle from norms to practice and then back again. That's going to be the scope of my presentation. And one of the reasons, these are two of my books, covers, and one of the things that you see, Politics of Human Rights in Argentina was my first book. It was my doctoral dissertation. This was in the era in which Argentina was emerging from a military dictatorship, the acute questions of transitional justice, truth commissions, trials. This is a photo of a demonstration of the mothers of the disappeared. And so there is the recognition, speaking of recognition of a human being, that there was a literal attempt to eradicate the existence and recognition. So recognition is clearly a part of the ethos of human rights. Trying to exclude people from human identity, and what's kind of fascinating, horrible, but fascinating about the Argentine case is that these were majority dominant citizens who were disappeared. There was no ethnic conflict, there was no minority status of any kind. These were middle class, students mainly who were disappeared, 30,000 people. And this was a pure strategy of political domination. Anyway, but the power of simply securing recognition, which then unleashed a whole series of very powerful political reforms. The second project that I did, and that carries us into a really different domain of human rights. So this was mainly in the events were mainly in the 1980s. The book comes out in 94. This book comes out in 2000, and it's mainly about the events of the 90s, and from tribal village to global village. And it is about the globalization of an indigenous rights movement based in Latin America. We're going from free to equal, for one thing, right? We're going from rights to dignity, and from rights situated in broader concepts that include collective rights, that include cultural rights, that include social rights, The movements that I was studying in the second project were in an era when all the states in which they were situated, I did the fieldwork in Ecuador, but it was also the Zapatistas in Mexico. These are all democracies. Civil liberties were assured. People weren't being disappeared, but they certainly were suffering. They were losing their lands. They were sometimes being physically attacked, but they were more being collectively and culturally, and in terms of access to their social rights and their cultural reproduction being attacked. So even in my own work, in the arc of realities that I have observed, we see a tension and an evolution of these concepts and an expansion of the ethos of human rights coming up from the reality. So that's the first thing I wanted to signal. So I've been at all of these workshops and conferences recently where everybody is debating, do human rights still work? How are we doing? Have we made progress? And you know, we want to say one of these projects, human rights, now more than ever. Here's where we stand, I think, both empirically and theoretically. And the two photos illustrate really the positive and negative answers to that question. So in terms of, you know, that there is progress, historically, we've gone from this arc from the 19th century anti-slavery movement to the anti-apartheid movement of the 20th century, where vast numbers of people, entire societies, have been liberated from legalized, state-sponsored oppression of significant social systems. That is a real accomplishment. That changes people's lives, that changes history, and we mustn't lose track of that. 2/3 of the countries in the world are democracies. Now, that doesn't mean that they always honor human rights, and there are a lot of problems still remaining, but that is a significant achievement. And, you know, the power of consciousness raising and of claims making has increased vastly as well. Amnesty International has 2 million members all over the world. On the other hand, of course, we see that human rights can't even do the work that it was designed to in the first generation in terms of war crimes, the refugee crisis of 65 million people, xenophobia, including quite prominently the US, and gender violence, which affects an estimated 1/3 of the world's women. So that's 1/6 of the world's population. And so the two photos symbolize this. The top photo, does anybody recognize that? I'm just curious whether only people who work on Latin America. That's Maria da Pena. She is a survivor of domestic violence in Brazil. Brazil has one of the worst problems of femicide in the Western Hemisphere. She spearheaded a reform movement that got a path-breaking domestic violence law passed in Brazil. This is her campaigning in her wheelchair, reading the law that bears her name, the Maria da Pena law, which, with the Brazilian flag in the background. So this is a kind of epitome of actually a successful social movement campaign by an empowered victim, survivor, charismatic voice that symbolizes a struggle and has inscribed, you were talking about the young woman being taken to the brothel. Well, in this case, women's rights are human rights. That slogan has actually been mainstreamed, and it has led to incredibly significant reforms, separate women's police stations, prosecutions, hotlines. So, you know, tens of thousands of lives have been saved because of this kind of recognition of it. That's the positive potential of human rights as an ethos and as an expanding ethos looking to new issues. And of course, Alan Kurdi, the child who was killed, who drowned crossing the Mediterranean as a refugee from Syria, symbolizes the failure and the inability even to protect refugees who were part of the origins of the post-war rights regime. So in theory, the theory that I run across is that you know, there's historic progress, hard times, and harsh criticisms. And the criticisms come from left, right, and center. So first of all, every nationalist in the world claims that rights are too much, they impinge on sovereignty. And this comes from dominant states and post-colonial states. Kind of every government thinks that human rights are too much. People who are concerned with labor rights and social rights and economic and cultural rights say rights are just this thin, legal, political. It's not actually true in terms of the claims and the documents. But you know, rights are not enough. They're just this thin civil legal veneer that don't address the prime drivers of oppression and power distortions in our lives. And then, of course, rights are the wrong kind. They're about law, and the source of oppression is not law. My Human Rights and Private Wrongs book really talks about human rights claims vis-a-vis globalization, the issues particularly of human trafficking, private perpetrators of abuse. And so this is a challenge for human rights. Okay, so my response to all of these kinds of theoretical challenges are that we can make more progress reading up from the experience and what works and what doesn't work if we say rights are not the answer, not something that we should be seeking to discover the ultimate formula for. And of course, this is a pragmatist constructivist response, so that's my philosophical cover. And I'll stick to it. And what rights are an evolving set of claims and constructed principles that tell us in every era, in every society, and in global society, who is human, what is right, and who is responsible. Those are the three things human rights have to do for us. And the success story of human rights is a constant expansion of who is human, right? Slaves are human, non-whatever dominant religion, non-Christians are human, women are human, non-citizens are human, you know, inclusion in, because every society and every culture has rights for someone. What is right? And this evolves with both the scope of, are you looking at the national, global level? Are you looking only at the public sphere and interaction with government? Or are you also looking at employers and families and things that happen in other spaces? And who is responsible? Again, the dominant doctrines and instruments talk about the government, the state is ultimately responsible for fulfilling your rights. Well, what if you're not in your state? What if it's happening somewhere else? So that's the frontier for expansion of who is responsible. And you know, the famous statement, every right requires a responsibility. Every right has to have an addressee. So the movement that we see is sort of what, who, where, what you should be able to answer about any kind of principle. What are rights? And we're starting to have this conversation here today. Are rights freedom, equity, dignity, empowerment, justice, inclusion? Those are not the same thing. They should coincide in some ultimate sense, but this is where a lot of the tension lies. The who is an aspiration to universalism. Who is human? Everyone. The where is this expanding process as well. And the when is evolving. So the next question then is, how do we get there? And now we're getting to the promised idea of the politics of persuasion. So reading up from the 26 human rights campaigns of speaking rights to power, you know, when it works, how does it work? Fully aware that it doesn't always work. When does it seem to work? And so, you know, Malala's there as an embodiment of human rights in hard times. Someone who was up against a number of forms of oppression, and managed to make her voice heard and actually to expand the concept. Because notice that she's working not just on women's rights, children's rights, but on education, the right to education, showing how the right to education is mixed with and an enabling right for these other kinds of rights. So you can't just say women's rights are human rights. Yes, you have the right to vote. Yes, you can go to work. You have to provide education. Education which was seen certainly from the Northern and the Western perspective as a social right, an add-on, something that governments do for people once they're developed enough. But no, in fact, if you don't have a right to education, you don't have a right to development. You don't have a right to survival. You don't have a right to participation in key social institutions. So you begin to see more crossover. All right, so again, I'm sort of going to flip the slide here, start at the bottom. So rather than the how of rights being that we discover them, this is sort of the dominant legal tradition. You know, we figure out what should be a right, and we read documents. There are two other ways. There is practice of law and governance, and there's construction of claims and movements. And how do we get people to do these things? How do we get people to participate in practice and construction? There are, I think, at least 4 kind of pathways. One is altruism, empathy, and humanization, which is always countering dehumanization. Because one of the things we observe, if we didn't already know that humanization was important and building empathy and altruism, it's that every system of power, every system of oppression has as a systematic part of its strategy dehumanization. So, labeling people, calling people vermin, tattooing numbers on their arms, setting them up as excluding people, you know, from the category of the human, right? They're heretics, they're vermin, they're rapists, they're terrorists. You have to label people that way in order to detach them from the human community. But you need more than that, because you can't always get people to empathize. People don't always have contact with each other. People are sometimes too afraid, or their interests are at odds. So you also have to have rational and strategic arguments of interdependence. We have to respect each other's rights because we need that for the peace of our society. We have to educate people from a disadvantaged group because we need more workers. We have to pay attention to health care for everybody because otherwise your kids are going to get sick from their kids. There are a couple of other things going on, though. There are orienting ideologies that people imbue, that people are socialized with. Religions typically play this role. But there are other kinds of universalist ideologies. Like one of the things I discovered is that the countries that have made the most progress the most rapidly in democratization, where democratization has been linked with rights, recent democratizers, are those in which social democracy, where there was some kind of a social democratic party or there was some kind of a social democracy ethos available. So Costa Rica, for example, is the most democratic country in the Americas, and you know, and small and vulnerable and doesn't have any kind of development basis, and has sort of leapfrogged ahead of its peers, and that is there is a very interesting story about social democracy, social democratic parties, and the linkages there that even allowed them to resist when they were trying to make peace in the Central American Wars and the US cut off aid, and they actually were able to go to Europe and get some compensating aid because, you know, they're a teeny tiny country right under the dominance of the US. So ideology can actually play a very critical role, access to a universalist ideology. And then finally, again, I'm leaping around the slides a little bit, but that'll keep your eyes going, the roles. So I was talking in the media interview about how I'm involved in all these academic freedom networks and Scholars at Risk and all of these things, where I readily identify with the role of people who are just like me. I have a cross-cutting identity. And so we're beginning to see these kinds of solidarity and coalitions that build around this. It's a way to activate solidarity. Okay, keeping on here, because I think I've slowed down a little bit. So this is sort of what I knew for maybe the first 20 years about the politics of persuasion and how you can read up from the progress and the positive side and the optimism. But what's happening recently? What's happening recently is, and why I say, you know, the challenge to the cosmopolitan ethos. In my Speaking Rights to Power book, one of the people I profile as someone who is not only charismatic voice of leadership on human rights, I profile Aung San Suu Kyi as someone who mobilized transnational solidarity in a pretty brilliant way, and who translated and bridged, you know, kind of getting back at these cultural relativist arguments, which I always hate, and say, look at how certain people have been able to bridge from universal human rights, which, yes, they sometimes have more Western origins, but people translate them. And there's this anthropologist, Sally Engel-Mary, some of you may know, who talks about that, you know, it's not that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't say, oh, human rights are Western. Well, penicillin's Western, you know? Good things can be invented someplace and can be useful someplace else. But you have to figure out how to use them. She talks about how people, she calls it vernacularization. I think translation works. People translate human rights. So one of the brilliant moves of Aung San Suu Kyi is that she appealed to a cosmopolitan audience, but she also translated, she used a lot of Buddhist symbolism. And I learned about this, right? She was also the, you know, she embodied a lot of, she had a lot of social capital. She was the daughter of one of the independence leaders of Burma. So, you know, she had her princess hat, she had her cosmopolitan hat, and then she had her Buddhist, and, you know, she kind of used all of these as an appeal. But somehow, you know, the Buddhist part, the translation part, turns and becomes a competitive, regressive identity and doesn't line up perfectly with human rights. So all over the world, we see regressions in human rights, including in our own country, of course. We see backlash. We see counter norms. We see people saying, oh, no, 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 we need family values. So, you know, it's okay to be homophobic. Oh, no, 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 we need our national identity, so, you know, we need to impose our religion. So it's not even that they are paying the tribute of hypocrisy, claiming human rights and then not implementing them. They're actually voicing a counter principle and claiming the validity of that. And this, I think, is the deepest threat to human rights in the 21st century. And this is what I'm the most worried about. And one of the things, when I think about Aung San Suu Kyi, and when I think about some of what I thought were the positive features of the politics of persuasion, is the decline of the earlier universalisms. The universalisms that, in the 20th century, were the basis of, you know, socialism leads to labor rights and worker solidarity. Christianity takes a more universalist turn and becomes more of a source of, you know, liberation theology in Latin America, which has a social justice doctrine and so forth. Almost every universalist tradition, Buddhism with Aung San Suu Kyi, somehow regresses or loses some of that universalist character. And that's I think, the leading challenge that I would like to think about more. So where are we with human rights, the crossroads of human rights? So in some of the edited volumes, when I try to summarize what people are researching all over the world, I find that there are sort of 4 different movements, and I don't know if you can see, yeah, the arrows are clear up there, okay. Good, so human rights is actually moving in 4 different directions, and that's why we're all confused and exhausted, among other things. But at least we can sort of map them out. So the first thing the first direction is kind of business as usual, and that's gaps. The gaps are the places where human rights never quite did the job, and those gaps include sovereignty and states having the power, no matter what they sign, no matter what they say, that as long as states retain the monopoly of force, they do have the power to deny and refuse granting rights to their citizens, or not allowing, and then the second one is, or limiting rights to their citizens, and not extending rights to all the people who are not citizens or who are in some ways second-class citizens, and we'll talk more about what I mean by that. Migrants are second-class citizens, but also, indigenous peoples in many societies still are second-class citizens. People of mixed nationality, women, workers in different circumstances literally have lower legal status. That's still true in many countries. Another gap is that it's always been true that countries that don't have a full monopoly of force, or where the government has become corrupted in certain ways systematically, can systematically undermine human rights. The leading case here is Mexico. Mexico's a democracy. I'm going to observe an election in Mexico this summer, by the way. And I think 30,000 people have been killed this year in Mexico. Some of those by government agents, but many not. So when you have a fundamental loss of security, human rights simply don't do the job. So that's one direction. Then moving down, there is all that positive stuff of expanding rights, expanding mobilization, expanding norms of rights and health rights, for example, human right to water, and mechanisms. Then another direction is contracting, declining democracy, counter norms, and things I was just talking about, and also the hegemony of illiberal powers. Where people turn to China for development aid, for example, and then there's no condition on how that aid will be used. But the final direction, which is, I think, where the hope lies, is contesting. So growth of solidarity law and governance pathways. Now, I have a slide about each of these directions to illustrate a little more, because I don't want this to be too abstract, and I claim I'm coming up from practice, so I better do that. So in terms of expanding rights, expanding who, expanding how, what are the pathways here? What's working here? Empathy, interdependence, and construction. So the new claims, things like environmental justice, things like reproductive rights, new voices and spaces, translation of health rights into different settings. So health rights can include access to essential medicines in the developing world, and the struggle for access. It began with the struggle for access to HIV, anti-HIV, antiretrovirals, and now extends to malaria and children's rights and all kinds of things, and the new kinds of rights and spaces developing around new media and social media. New mechanisms, we talked a little bit about water, human right to water, and control over water as a human right. I don't know if you guys know that people from Flint have gone to UN bodies to talk about the human right to water. That, to me, is a fascinating and very hopeful development. Another mechanism, my colleague Pittsburgh, Michael Goodhart's working on the phenomenon of human rights cities, and there are about 500 human rights cities all over the world. So there's a way of localizing and creating a very alternative and yet sometimes effective structure. So there's structures, there are claims, there are new voices, I have all these great photos, from my work on gender violence. I had the Maria de Pena. Here's a woman from Guatemala who is protesting against femicide, and this is the fundamental ethos. This is an illustration of the ethos expanding. That sign says, "This body is mine. Don't touch, don't rape, don't kill." So there is an extension of human rights into that most fundamental and spanning public and private sphere violations. So that's kind of good news. Then on the other side, on the contracting and contesting side, notice that on the expanding side, it's mostly about who, and it's mostly about the interdependence claims and institutions. The contracting is mostly about responsibilities and about dehumanization and governance gaps. So of these lists I'm giving you, some of them are falling more on the expanding side and some are falling more on the contracting side. And that's part of what I'm trying to do for the purposes of this project, is figure out why the whole package of human rights norms and practices, half of it is working well and half of it, is declining. Okay, so declining democracy like Turkey, counter-cosmopolitanism, backlash like homophobia, resistance practices. I've actually done what I always do in lectures. I've previewed some of what was on this slide in giving illustrations of previous slides, therefore I can rush ahead. And okay, so in terms of reconstructing human rights, what does this reading of what's happening, what's working, what's not working tell us in terms of the politics of persuasion? And then I'm going to go on to the ethos. I'm circling back to the ethos as I promised to do. So in terms of the politics of persuasion, what is working? Use your words, promote empathy, interdependence, and global institutions for their informational functions, even when they lack authority. And the using your words and coalitions is illustrated by the photo. This was at the LA Women's March last year, a group called Abraham's Daughters of Jewish and Muslim Women marching together against religious persecution and stigma all over the world. Follow the money, so be attentive to market mechanisms and how social and economic rights are not always coming from the state, and we are expanding our consciousness and practices around corporate social responsibility and other kinds of mechanisms like that. Speaking of which, use the right tool for the job. So be attentive not just to law, but to public policy on issues like water, transportation. Work at the regional, meaning like Latin American or African, European level, as well as the national level, as well as the local level and things like human rights cities. Okay, so we've got a sense of where the ethos came from, what are some of the principles of the politics of persuasion, which ones are working well, which ones are not working as well. Here's a vague sense of political strategies. This is where I've gotten so far in my own work. Stimulated by this conference, I go back to this idea of the ethos and of the decline of cosmopolitanism and of, the rise and fall of Aung San Suu Kyi, because I'm still worried about this. And I hope you'll worry with me and help me to figure out how to worry better. So can there be a post-liberal ethos of human rights? Is that about changing what rights are or how they are constructed? As we try to work expanding human rights, empathy the attempts to engage empathy are constantly met by a politics of fear. And it's very successful, and it can't be rationally addressed. We have this history and this potential of expanding what is right and expanding our idea of power relation to shifting conditions. So medical rights, corporate social responsibility, globalization, gender violence, we know it's not just governments anymore. But there's a limit to that logic. There's a limit to how far we can go with that and to our leverage over those kinds of conditions. So we have a more pragmatist toolbox, but there's a governance gap. How do we get at these things? We can now recognize a broader range of rights, but it was hard enough to get treaties and states and laws passed. What do we even do? We can boycott. We can boycott a lot, but that's not quite gonna do it. The Dream of a Common Language is, some of you might recognize the Adrienne Rich poem that has always kind of, to me, been an inspiration. So the functional cooperation that we've cobbled together can't survive with a declining ethos, and the biggest gap is this decline in altruistic ideology. And so, finally, I think I'm in just about in good time, the crisis of cosmopolitanism is that we have circled back to a crisis in trying to figure out what is right, in moving beyond the sort of default mode of human rights. Human rights can include recognition, inclusion, justice, but the default mode is freedom. In moving beyond identities and the kind of self-defense advocacy mode to connecting by roles, thinking about status, thinking about communities of belief, the only positive directions that I see is that there is a new script to address the counterclaims that does involve translation, transnational outreach, and construction via practice. So the 500 human rights cities, the interreligious coalitions. This kind of stuff is happening, but it's new and it's fragile. And so the conclusion is not that there's a problem with the ethos of human rights. It's that we urgently need to expand and construct both the content of the ethos and the practice, and unblock some of those pathways of the politics of persuasion. So circling back, what do we want? More rights, not less.
Into the practical element. So we will now entertain questions.
Yes, there was a lady in the back and then Yes.
It is, I think, it was.
I'll speak up. So it seems from time to time, human rights marches under false flags. And so maybe the war in Iraq was an intervention involving the carrying of the banner of human rights, and it turned out to be something else. Or a certain faction in Syria is armed in the name of human rights, and it turns out that the weapons provided fall into the wrong hands. So it suggests maybe the need of some kind of institutional identification, or some means by which institutionally we might need to inoculate ourselves against the false flag campaigns under human rights. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, that's a great question, and I think I have a great answer, which is that a part of cosmopolitanism that I didn't quite formally address, but that's sort of implicit here in the global governance part of it, is that multilateralism is supposed to be the institutional check on that. So if you have a truly multilateral and a truly globally constructed intervention, it should be somewhat immunized from national interest and manipulation and domination of great powers. Even that may be, even just that governance mechanism may not be enough, but then you've got international law. You have to justify intervention. You have to articulate some sort of a humanitarian threat, and so forth. Now, that doesn't completely safeguard, but it would certainly have put a big brake on Iraq, the potential projected growth of layers of global governance like the EU and the rising power of the EU was also envisaged as a way to balance and, notice that, and what I will say in a slightly positive defense of global governance is that in the Americas, surprisingly, the Inter-American Court, the Inter-American Human Rights Institute, the Inter-American Commission have been some of the most important, not only norm innovators, but periodic enforcers of human rights. And some of the positive changes we've seen, breaking the amnesties for the military in Argentina, came through the Inter-American Human Rights Court. Maria da Pena law came through a kind of pincer effect of an inter-American human rights ruling and social movement protests. So Latin American states, interestingly, are more responsive to that dynamic. Great powers will always be less constrained, but the potential's there. So the only other thing I would say on a normative basis is being careful to distinguish democratization and regime change from human rights. Democracy is a system of government. It's not equivalent to human rights. We have a right to democracy, but that's not the sum of human rights. But, I mean, I take your point, but I think there are 2 or 3 potential responses. I don't think it's a completely intrinsic contradiction.
That was an excellent speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Judith Torney-Perta, and I worked with Tom Bergenthal on the establishment of the Inter-American Institute all those years ago.
Well, thank you.
I'm a developmental psychologist, and I studied the development of civic and human rights attitudes in adolescence and did an extremely large study of several 100,000 adolescents in a number of countries. What role do you think, and the other thing, I don't want to go on forever here, but the other thing is that the National Council for the Social Studies here in the United States has made human rights one of its aims or principles or initiatives.
Yes.
And this echoes something they did a number of years ago without much success during the Reagan administration because they got attacked for doing that. So I'm trying to help them to understand the basis of attitudes that are held by adolescents and adults about human rights in order to better understand how to mobilize people. What do people think of when you talk about human rights, and what do they think of as the threats or solutions? I wish they could all hear your speech, but what role do you think that might play, and what direction is the most productive one to investigate?
That's a great question. So one thing is, just to circle back to some of what I was saying about translation. There's a fascinating team doing some studies around the world of different attitudes toward human rights in different countries and trying to sort of bust this, again, myth of cultural relativism, that human rights are only a Western thing, or they only work for people in certain kinds of countries. And in fact, they find, and they have, I think they're working in Mexico, Morocco, Nigeria. They've carefully selected countries from all world regions and different religious traditions and so forth. And they find that more people than not do endorse some sort of basic principle of human rights. But they do see it fundamentally as holding governments accountable, and are frustrated that there are not more non-governmental applications, that they see other issues in their lives. That's what, and the lead author, there are 4 or 5 different people, but James Ron, R-O-N, is a constant in these projects. So if you want to look up some of that stuff. But back to more fundamental, so that's the global perspective, which is the one that I'm the most familiar with. But I did a workshop at the Chicago Holocaust Museum, teacher training, because Illinois, California, New York, I think, have continuing education requirements for teachers to do tolerance education. And so there are these programs, and they asked me to talk about Argentina, and to talk about Latin American dictatorships, and what if there were common principles for the U.S. So I tried to think about what those sort of lessons were, one of the things is youth's identification with being stigmatized and excluded from opportunity and participation in their own society. And that's sort of something we're seeing right now in our own society. When a society is kind of breaking its social contract to protect and develop and inspire its youth, that is a powerful lever for consciousness of human rights. In Argentina, youth were literally being disappeared, and here, people's lives are at risk when you don't have the opportunity to get a job or something. So that developmental appeal, the opportunity appeal, you deserve access to these opportunities, I think is a powerful lever. The other thing, I'm jumping around a little here because I haven't thought about this deeply, but in terms of social media, social media goes many different directions. But on the gender violence project that I was working on, I first became aware of some of the empowering young women in India, Pakistan, Egypt, Brazil, posting very empowering material through social media and having viral campaigns. So I was working on this project, and I had a young man, Brazilian law student, who was working with me. And he came to me very excited because there was an Indian, it was in the aftermath of the Delhi rape. And there was an Indian women's movement video called, ironically, "It's Your Fault." And it was a bitter, sarcastic, it showed women dressed in 27 different, women in saris, women in Western clothes, and so forth. And apparently this had gone viral in Brazil. It was all over this young man's social networks. He thought it was hip and cool and interesting. And he knew that his prestigious professor was interested in violence against women, but this video from a different society had just opened his eyes in a whole different way. It had promoted empathy and altruism in a whole different way across gender, culture, all kinds of things. So there is this, I don't know if that story makes sense, there's a lot of detail there, but there is this amazing potential of social media. I mean, it has negative potential too, but to cross certain barriers and to promote the empathy, the humanization, I guess. I saw it in microcosm there, and I think I've seen it in other kinds of campaigns.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop it there because we're running short of time. Save your questions for when we have the roundtable as well, okay? All right, let's take a 15-minute break. Again, please go to the back for coffee and drinks. And
if a couple of you want to chat, we can do that too.